Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're discussing the California water rights system and current proposed legislation trying to change it. Water rights in California provide certainty for the availability of water for cities and towns throughout the state, especially for the fertile ag land within TID. That certainty allows for continued investment in infrastructure and the ability of TID to reliably store and deliver water, even in dry years. However, as the water rights system continues to be scrutinized, recent legislative proposals to change the water rights system would remove that certainty. On this episode, I'm joined by TID External Affairs Manager Josh Weimer to discuss the California water rights system, potential issues and improvements for the current system, and the bills proposing to change the system. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you previously joined us for an episode of the TID Water and Power Podcast. It was episode 11 back in March of 2022. And at that time, we were discussing the district's Solar Over Canals pilot project, Project Nexus. So thanks for coming back to visit us again. And for our newer listeners, can you give us a little background of your time with the district?
Yeah, so I joined the district back in 2015 as the legislative analyst. And so that job was really to read and analyze all state and federal legislation and then go and advocate on behalf of the district, both in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. A few years later, I was promoted to the Government Affairs Manager position. And so I started to oversee the water and energy regulatory advocacy in addition to the legislative advocacy as well. And then in 2020, I was promoted to the External Affairs Manager position, and that oversees the government affairs, communication, and then our energy services programs as well.
Right on. So you still hold on to a component of that legislative tie that you started at the district with and now have expanded into your department manager position.
Yeah, I still do the same job I got hired to do 8 years ago, and I love that. That's my passion. And so in addition, I get to do all the other fun stuff with communications and public benefits.
Very cool. And we were fortunate enough to have two of your direct reports, your regulatory analysts, Herb Smart and Austin Avery, on our last episode of the podcast, talking about what they do in the regulatory scheme of things. So thanks for letting us borrow them.
It was a great podcast. So now 2 podcasts back to back, you get the full government affairs team.
That's right. That's great. Okay, so we're glad to have you back to talk to us this time about the district's water rights and the current challenges that the California water rights system is facing. So let's start with kind of an overview of what the water rights system is. How are water rights in California defined?
Yes, water rights in California are very complex. And so I'm just going to keep this high level. And for people interested in kind of a more deeper dive on the topic, Jason Carkeet did a great job in episode 7 of the podcast. So I would recommend anybody who wants to get more information to go back and listen to that because that's the best podcast. So I'm just going to do high level here. So in California, water rights are property and they can be sold, transfer to willing buyers, to put that water to a reasonable use. And so while the rights are technically property, that is the right to use the water, and it's not the ownership of the water. And so the water rights allow the holder to put the water to a beneficial use. So essentially, by beneficial use, it means things that are beneficial to the public. And so the 2 largest uses are irrigation and then urban domestic drinking water use. So that's a beneficial use. So an unreasonable use would be something like diverting millions of gallons to like wash off a street. That's clearly not beneficial. It's not a good use of water. So water right holders and users, we have a certain level of certainty and clarity that comes from the legal structure around water rights and the way the system is designed based off of priority. And that's really important to agencies like ours and others who are really focused on long-term planning. How are we going to provide those services to our customers? So this certainty, based off of the priority system, the legal structure, has allowed the development of really California's entire water infrastructure over the last 150 years that all Californians rely on. And we all rely on it for our drinking water supply, our agriculture production. So really everything that this state utilizes has a foundation in the water rights system. And so we have made billions of dollars of investments that have allowed California to be what we all recognize as it today.
So as you mentioned, the ownership of the right is the right to use that water, not the right to the water itself. So there's not a certain acre feet of water that the district is guaranteed, but we have our place in priority to use a certain amount of water.
Yeah, so each water right that the district holds has a certain claim and a certain right to use up to a certain amount of water. And whether that's right to use it for a direct diversion for irrigation purposes, to storage, or for hydro generation, there is a claim for the water right and then a ability to use up into that certain amount of diversion, storage, or generation amount.
So who in California can actually own these water rights?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the water rights, they're property, and they can be sold and transferred and applied to from different parties. And so some of these parties who own water rights are agencies like TID, or cities, county, even the state, or individual landowners as well. So I think it's important to note that 80% of the surface water rights claimed by volume, by amount of acre feet, are actually held by public agencies. And so that's really important to note that, this water, the water rights system is largely for the benefit of all Californians and held by public agencies, not individual landowners or water right holders themselves. So TID, for example, is a water right holder. However, we hold that on behalf of our entire community and our customers.
Mm-hmm. Everyone who might benefit from that water.
Exactly. So if you live within our service territory, you are benefiting from the district's holding for water rights, whether irrigation and electricity.
Right. So I know it's often talked about or water rights as referred to as senior water rights holders or junior water rights holders. What does that mean?
Yeah, so we have a lot of great names for water rights in California. And so California has a priority system, which is often defined, and I think Jason said this really well, is first in time, first in right. So it is a priority system. And for example, if you and I both own land, we both want to develop that. We both put in a claim to say we need a certain amount of water to fully develop this property or to farm. If I put that claim in and start putting that to use a month before you, I am more senior than you in the priority system.
And that has nothing to do with where on the system we're pulling that water from necessarily. It's strictly a chronological timeline.
Yeah, and that's an appropriative right. And so riparian right is if you're right along the river system itself. And so that has a certain level of priority because you are on the river system itself. And so first in time, first in right is really that appropriative use, removing that water from the river system at a certain location and putting it to a specific use.
Okay, great.
So 1914 is a year that is pretty important in the California water system, water rights system, and that is directly tied to the Water Commission Act. So the Water Commission Act was passed in 1913, and the California Water Commission was seated in December of 1913. And so that changed how water rights were acquired beginning in 1914. And so the Water Commission, that's the predecessor for the California State Water Resources Control Board that we know today. So pre-1914 water rights were a lot like mining claims. And so, if you think about it this way, a party would put literally a stake in the ground or a stake in the river saying, I'm claiming a certain amount of flow rate from this location. A lot of our early rights were in what we call miner's inches. Some of the ones after that were in cubic feet per second. So they're all by these unique volume amounts, but it's really specific to what that claim was for. And so miner's inches were clearly for a mining right, to using that water for mining purposes.
Interesting. And then what happened post-1914?
Yeah, so pre-1914, you put that claim and then you would go to the county seat and file that claim. And so it was really a regional water right that is specific to that area. And so post-1914, the Water Commission which is now the State Water Resource Control Board, would receive an application for an appropriative water right and then approve or reject that application. So very different than the pre-1914s. So essentially, this puts the State Water Board as having jurisdictional authority over the post-1914 water rights, but not the pre-1914 water right. However, they do still have some jurisdictional authority over pre-1914s. And I would suggest that people that are interested in knowing all of those details, please listen to Jason's podcast for a much deeper dive into that. And I do think it's important to note that the legislature, when they created the Water Commission, at that time, they did not give the Water Commission the authority over those rights before 1914. I think that's important to note that that was a clear decision made at that time.
And why was that decision made?
So I'm not specifically sure why they made that decision, but you can make the assumption that it is a lot easier to create a new agency with new rules for future development of water rather than looking at all of the unique thousands of applications that are specific to certain counties or river systems and giving this broad authority over all of those unique circumstances.
Sure, that makes sense. So I know TID holds a number of different types of water rights. Are the rights we hold riparian or appropriative, or how are those classified?
We actually have both, and it really goes to what the specific use is. And so we are the oldest appropriative water right holder on the Tuolumne, meaning we have the most senior water rights in the priority system. And so we mentioned earlier that seniors are often referred to as pre-1914, but you could have multiple senior water right holders who are pre-1914. And so that's really where the priority system lines up. So say you have 10 water right claims for pre-1914, they're still the priority system. So the earliest one is the senior most water right holder on that system. But we do have appropriative water rights. We have riparian water rights. We have those rights that are for direct diversion, for storage, and then the riparian is for energy generation.
And so in holding those rights, what does that mean?
So I think with the water right system, it's really important to note that as a water right holder, we are allowed to divert within your right and when that water is available. So, and we'll talk about this probably later, is there's a perception that pre-1914s is kind of a wild, wild west. There's not a lot of rules around that. And that's not the case, right? There's a priority system. And so when water is not available, you cannot divert. Or else other water right holders who have a more senior water right are going to know that, and they're going to be harmed, and you can go through the administrative process there. So in a year like this, it's safe to say that most people can exercise their water right regardless of priority right. There's so much water in the system. And then obviously in drier times, say a drought, there's not as much water in the system. And so you really start to exercise that priority system. And so the junior most water right holder is going to start to be cut back because that water is not available. I think this is really important that when you apply for the water right, there's terms, there's conditions, you know that you're applying for water when it's available. And so it's not going to be available in every water year. I think it's important that the districts, TID and MID, we filed for floodwater rights last year. And so that's when there's times of excess water. We want to be able to have the right to capture that, to put it to beneficial use, to recharge the aquifer, to improve environmental releases and requirements, and to just have more water storage. Of course, that water is not going to be available in all water years. It's when it is available, you want to have that. And so I think that's just something that oftentimes gets kind of lost. And sometimes there's a talk of over allocation of the water right systems for streams. And that's not the case. It's when there is water available, when there's a system that is not fully appropriated, you have the right to apply for that water to put it to use.
Mm-hmm. And I think there are two key things there. Number one, that you have the right to use that water when it's available without doing harm to other either water rights holders or the environment or whatnot. And the other thing that you mentioned about the recent rights that TID and MID have applied for stormwater use, I think in years like we've just had, people are seeing this abundance of water and wondering, why aren't the districts or other places in the state using this water? but without realizing that you actually have to have a right to use that water. It's not just a free-for-all. Even in the more modern day water right system, that priority system still applies.
So I think it's important to note that one of the water right categories is the right to divert to storage. And so when there's a dry year and maybe people don't have the right to directly divert, that's why we have storage throughout the state. It's 4 times of drought to be able to draw on that water.
Who holds pre-1914 rights in California?
There's quite a few different agencies, individuals who hold these rights. They could be individual landowners, irrigation districts like ours, water agencies, cities, even the state of California holds these rights. And approximately about 40% of the appropriated water in California is held by pre-1914 water right holders.
All right. So now that we kind of have the groundwork for the California water rights system, let's talk a little bit about TID's water rights specifically.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, TID has historic water rights on the Tuolumne, and we hold these water rights on behalf of the diverse community that we represent. And so the district, who jointly owns these rights with the Modesto Irrigation District, we have an assortment of both pre- and post-1914 water rights, and the oldest of which right is from 1871. So these assortment of water rights, they cover our ability to directly divert water to storage, and also to generate power.
So for a number of different beneficial uses, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So as a water rights holder, what is required of the district? Obviously, we gain benefit from the ability to use this water. What's required of us?
Yeah, TID is very transparent in the way that we hold our water rights, and that's important to us. We are a public agency. We are owned by our community. Our information is public and it's out there, and it's something that we take a lot of pride in, as being transparent and very open in the way that we do our business. And so we regularly file both annual and enhanced reporting with the State Water Board. That is all publicized on their website. It's publicized on our website. We have these detailed records that show how much we diverted and what from what right every single year. We also pay a significant water rights fee annually for the state to enforce and implement the water rights system. And so that's pretty important. We participate and actively help the state through funding enforce the existing water rights system.
Okay. So these water rights don't come for free. There are rules that have to be followed and fees that have to be paid.
Yeah, and as a public agency, we are we follow all of the rules, all the requirements, and go actually above what is required because it's in the best interest of our community.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. So before we get into the current challenges to the water rights system, I think it'd be helpful to have a quick discussion on just the California legislature. How does the state legislature and bills come into being? What is that process like?
It's a great question, and it's pretty complex. And so I'd love to be able to talk about this. This is a fun topic. And so at its most basic, the California legislature has a 2-year legislative session. So that means the legislative session that started this year will go for this year, and then there's a second year that will start in 2024. And so in California, we have 2 different houses of representation. We have the Assembly and we have the Senate. The Senate is made up of 40 members across the state, and the Assembly is made up of 80 members. And those all have equal proportion of population throughout the state, and that's how that's divided. And so for TID, we have 1 senator who covers our entire service territory, but we actually have 4 Assembly members that have portions of our service territory. That was different last year before redistricting, and they redrew the lines of representation. And so it's kind of constantly evolving who is going to represent us at any given year.
Okay.
So these senators and Assembly members, they actually have a limit of the amount of bills that they can introduce over those 2 years. And so senators can introduce 40 bills over those 2 years. And then Assembly members can introduce 50 bills over those 2 years. And just so for an example, this year, over 2,600 pieces of legislation have been introduced so far.
Oh, my word.
Yeah, there's no shortage of legislation or work for government affairs teams across the state to be working on.
No shortage of reading material, that's for sure. So what does a bill have to do then to actually make it to the governor's desk?
That is a very long and detailed process. And while there's a tremendous amount of legislation that gets introduced, California legislature actually works on a pretty strict timeline. And so that timeline is very helpful for us to be able to follow legislation as it gets introduced, to have an idea of where are some very important milestone dates. And so early on, so once a bill is introduced, bill gets introduced, you actually have 30 days, nothing can happen on a piece of legislation, which is helpful for a person like me that has to look at thousands of pieces of legislation. I can at least go through them and then kind of evaluate, okay, this one could impact us. This one definitely doesn't. Just put it off on the list. So that 30-day window is nice for a person like me. So once that bill is introduced, goes through the 30 days, then it gets assigned to a policy committee. So all bills have to go through policy committees, and there's multiple policy committees that all have certain overviews. And so one that is important to water rights is the Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee, or the Senate Natural Resources Committee. And so that really is a very broad umbrella. And so bills that have relation to that subject matter expert will go into those policy committees. Now, a bill could be referred to multiple policy committees, or if it has a financial tie, it could get referred to the appropriations committees. Just like if a bill has something to do with the law or the legal structure, it could get tagged in judiciary as well. And so really depending on the bill itself, it's going to go through multiple policy committees. Now, if the bill makes it through the policy committees, which isn't a given, and that's kind of the first step in the way that bills could not make it through the session or be dead for that year. They could maybe come back the following year. But once they go through policy committee, then they go to their floor of the House of Origin. And so for the Assembly, if it clears all the Assembly policy committees, it goes to the Assembly floor for a vote. On the Senate, the same thing goes to the Senate for a vote. Now, if those bills make it off of the floor, and there's a couple different types of bills. Vast majority of bills are what we call a majority vote bill. So they only require a majority vote. And then some bills have an urgency clause. So an urgency clause means that the bill could go into effect right away once it becomes signed. Whereas majority bills, for the most part, they all go into effect January 1st of the following year. So for an urgency clause bill, it needs 2/3 of the vote to go through. Similar with the budget, needs 2/3. So then it gets to the second house. So Assembly bills that pass, they go to the Senate. Senate bills, they go to the Assembly. Then they go through the entire policy process again, need to get voted on. If there's changes that happen in that house, then they have to go back to the other house for concurrence to make sure that you're voting on the exact same piece of legislation. If it makes it through all those steps, then it goes to the governor. The governor then has 30 days after the end of session to sign or veto those pieces of legislation.
Going back to this upwards of 2,600 pieces of legislation that gets introduced each year, as you're reviewing those and you're kind of going through to see what might apply to TID and what wouldn't, I mean, what do those pieces of legislation span as far as the topics that they cover?
Yeah, it's a great question. And 2,600 pieces, it's such a large number. And it covers so many different topics. And so there's a lot of times you have these, local members. And so sometimes they carry very local specific, district specific bills is what we call them. But then other times, there's themes. And so I like to approach the legislative, review process of looking at certain types of themes. And so in California, some of the large pieces of legislation are direct results of something happening. And so the legislature is very reactionary to some of these large issues. And so, for example, we all remember back to 2017 and the Oroville incident that happened with their spillway. What we saw after that was a lot of focus in terms of dam safety. So pieces of legislation being introduced related to dam safety. we saw with that situation that we had to let a lot of people know about the practices that we do at our dams, our safety, the different types of material that our dam is made up and why it's different than Oroville. And so that was a direct result from that instances. So similar with, wildfires that, plagued the state for 3 summers, really bad ones, some caused by maybe some electric utilities. And so we saw direct legislation that led to regulation about how we have to operate wildfire mitigation planning, vegetation management, and other things along those lines. And then, of course, when we see flood or when we see drought, we always see legislation that comes out of that. So in the last drought, we saw the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act come out of that. And so that has directly came out of that drought situation. And then what we're seeing this year is that following the last 3 years of drought, we are seeing more and more interest in water management, because scarcity leads to these type of conversations. So when there's times of excess, we have a different conversation, but it's not normally the conversation about not everybody's able to get to their water rights. And so when there's times of scarcity, that leads to these conversations about, well, is the water right system that we have, is it efficient? Is it designed well enough to capture the changes that we're seeing in hydrology or the state's interest in water or different water pressures as well?
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. So then how does your role at TID, so specifically as it relates to the task of having to go through all of these different pieces of legislation and what you ultimately, the role you play in with those, how does that tie into how that legislation then moves through the system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really that's something that absolutely love about my job is kind of the philosophy or the approach that I take to advocating on behalf of TID. And really that's telling TID's unique story and our background and who we represent and making sure that our perspective is at the table in all of these conversations. And that is something that is crucially important because there are so many different conversations happening. There's so many pieces of legislation, making sure that how something could impact TID is being heard amongst members of the legislature, staff, because a lot of times somebody will introduce a piece of legislation and they don't think about all the unintended consequences or how this might impact some water agencies or electric utilities differently. And so that's my job to go up there and advocate on behalf of our community. And that's something that I absolutely love because this organization is such a bedrock, a foundational element in our community that going up there and ensuring that we've operated very well for 136 years. We need to make sure that we're operating for the next 136 well and making sure that we have the quality of life that we've come to expect in this area. And so we'll get to be up there and advocate on behalf of that. So the way that I approach pieces of legislation, obviously, if you're going to support a bill, it's great to be able to give very specific examples of why we support this, what this means to our community. Same with if you oppose a piece of legislation, giving very specific examples. So a lot of times broad, general, vague, like why we oppose something does not mean as much as very specific examples. And so when we oppose a piece of legislation, that means we go through a couple different steps. And so if a piece of legislation is just outright terrible, like it is just a bad piece of legislation, we're going to try to kill that bill. There's a variety of different ways that we can do that. But sometimes bad bills and bills that would impact us as TID, they're going to move through the process, whether they have certain political backing or support, or maybe a pretty powerful legislator is introducing it. So this bill is going to be received well amongst the colleagues up in Sacramento. And so at that time, we have to kind of make a political calculus of while we want to kill the bill, it's likely going to move forward. So how do we make a bad bill less bad? And that's definitely an interesting conversation. And you have to be a realist in the situation of while we would love to kill something, we would love for it not to have any impact to us. It's going to go through and it's going to impact us very poorly. And so how can we minimize that impact?
And I think that's an important distinction to make, is that it's not necessarily that we're in favor or we're against a bill and that's the end of the line. But like you said, you kind of have to be a realist and understand that there are going to be bills that go through that do have a negative impact to us. And how do we kind of mitigate that along the way to try and minimize the impacts?
Definitely. And it's not a static position, too. So you can't just take a oppose or support when the bill's introduced, because that bill is going to be amended and altered dozens of times.
That's a really good point.
A one-word tweak in a sentence of a bill that's 50 pages long might have a dramatic impact on the district. And so it's not you look at all the bills when they get introduced, you take your position and you're done for the year. You have to actively manage and review all the legislation and all the potential impacts as they get amended throughout the legislative session.
Right. Wow. Very scrutinizing approach for sure. Okay, so you mentioned that we're seeing bills introduced this year that are proposing to make changes to the water rights system. What are the current issues with the water rights system that these pieces of legislation are trying to quote unquote fix?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a large topic of conversation, and especially coming out of a drought. Like we mentioned earlier, scarcity leads to these type of conversations. And so there's many in California, or maybe there's a vocal minority, who knows, who believe that the California water rights system is antiquated and that it needs to be modernized. And so that's something that we see a lot. A system was designed 150 years ago. That system couldn't possibly still be effective, or it couldn't. It was designed for a certain hydrology. That hydrology is changing with climate change. Therefore, the system that we all have developed, the entire water system throughout California, needs to be changed to meet those changing external factors. And so there's others that continue to say that the water rights system isn't able to change with the changing dynamics of California, whether that's political dynamics that are changing, hydrology changing, or growing demands on the water system that are changing. There's those that say because the system is established so long ago, it's not flexible enough to be able to adapt to those different changing dynamics. There's definitely a large focus on equity, or the inequity of the water rights system in California. And so obviously at the time that the state was founded, water rights are property rights. And so in the 1850s, not everybody could own land. Not everybody was viewed equally throughout the state. And so there's definitely a large conversation and it's one of the top talking points about why the system needs to change, is that the system was designed and it specifically excluded certain portions of the population. Therefore, all of the rights that are established before 1914, therefore are inequitable. This is obviously something that we hear a lot. And I think that that's something that we talk a lot about, of while we hold these rights all the way back to 1871, we hold them on behalf of our community. And our community is incredibly diverse. And so it's my job to really talk about that. Now, while, 1871, we have all these different water rights, that was a very different social, political makeup than what we have now. But we hold them on behalf of our entire community.
And even as that community develops and changes, the rights are still held on behalf of everyone here.
Exactly. One additional thing that we hear, especially coming out of a drought year, is that some say that the state board lacks the authority to properly enforce the water rights system. Therefore, we need to give the state board more authority to be able to enforce the systems, whether it's to enforce the current system or to enforce the changing needs of the system. Therefore, we need to give the state board more authority.
Okay. So as you mentioned, these conversations are not new, but they certainly occur with greater frequency during times of scarcity, like we've just come out of with the last drought.
Yeah, these conversations definitely aren't anything new. And a lot of times what we've heard in the past is the system's antiquated, it's old, it needs to be either thrown out completely or it needs to be modernized. That's normally where the conversation is stopped. There are some significant challenges with throwing out the entire water rights system that the entire state of 40 million people depend on, that 150 years of investment, billions of dollars of investment that have created a very complex water infrastructure system in the state. Those investments are reliant on the water rights system. And so throwing those out completely and just starting over, it has significant challenges. And so that's always where the conversation is kind of stopped, because it's never that what's next. Well, if we throw it out, what is it replaced with? And those kind of details have been lacking for the most part. But what we've seen in the last few years is a very concentrated effort to say, here is some proposals to replace the system. We're seeing third-party agencies, think tanks, academia come up with very detailed proposals to change or overhaul the water rights system. And so these proposals, these white papers, they come out and then members of the legislature see them and then put them directly into a piece of legislation. So we're seeing more and more conversation about water rights and the need to modernize, and we're actually seeing that directly result in more legislation being introduced about water rights.
So let's then dive into some of these proposals and talk about what sparked these pieces of legislation specifically.
Yeah, definitely. And like I mentioned, scarcity drives these conversations. So the last 3 years, that drought was the third driest 3-year period on record for the Tuolumne watershed, and much of California experienced severe drought. And that drought then led to enhanced conversations about the lack of water, the scrutiny about the system. And so then that led to further conversations about water rights. Then we saw in the last 2 years that curtailments of water rights were imposed by the state board on many water systems throughout the state of California. And then that led to some very specific actions. And so one of the most often point to instance that has led to a lot of this legislation is some illegal diversion that happened up in Siskiyou County on the Shasta River. And so in August 2022, really the entire state was under curtailment orders, which means curtailment, there's not enough water in the system, therefore you cannot divert under your right. And there was a group of water users up in Siskiyou County who they told the state board that they were going to illegally divert against the curtailment. And so they diverted for 8 days, and they diverted 500 acre feet of water. And the penalty associated with that was $4,000. And some of the growers, when they were interviewed by the press, they said it was the cost of doing business, something that they factored into their decision making. So when I saw that and I read that quote, I said, well, there's going to be legislation introduced directly because of that one quote and that one situation. And so really that was probably the most obvious direct correlation between an instance, an issue, and then legislation introduced.
All right. So now let's talk about the bills that TID is specifically tracking. What are those that kind of rise to the top for us as far as impacts?
So thousands of bills are introduced every year, and we are actively engaging on hundreds of those. But 3 main bills on water rights this year are Assembly Bill 460, Assembly Bill 1337, and Senate Bill 389.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about each of these and what the author is trying to accomplish with each one?
Yeah, so Assembly Bill 460, or AB 460, as I'll probably refer to it in shorthand, is really a bill introduced by the chair of the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee, which that in of itself means something because she's the chair. Therefore, there's a certain amount of importance placed on bills because this bill would then have to go through her committee. So it's just a little political calculus that is important to when we analyze bills, and you analyze is a bill potentially going to move through the system? You look at the author, you look at all that. So anyways, long way of introing to say that this bill argues that the state board lacks the authority to move quickly enough to react to illegal diversions. And so she specifically cites the Shasta River issue. And then this bill also increases the penalties that would be charged if you illegally diverted. So this bill would grant the state board interim relief authority, and so that would change the way that current administrative remedies and processes go forward. Again, we're property right holders, therefore there's certain due process that we have the ability to invoke. And so rather than going through the existing ability and existing authority that they have to go through the Superior Court, request a stay, to request the illegal diversion stop, this would allow the state board to say, there's something happening, you need right now to stop. There's no due process, no ability for us to even see what information they're citing. And so that's a concern. What's additionally of concern is that this bill would allow for third parties to submit a petition to the state board and request interim relief. So it's not just the state board making this decision, it has the ability for other agencies and other agencies who maybe have their own agenda, and they could then go forward with that process.
So essentially it kind of introduces the opportunity for, I don't want to say a lot of false accusations, but truly, they could be unfounded accusations against water right holders in the way that they're using their water without us really having the opportunity to counteract that.
Exactly. And that's one of the points that we continue to raise is that if somebody raises these concerns and the state board deems that this is an issue that needs to be addressed right away without the ability to have a hearing, we have no ability to hear the evidence being raised or to provide our information. And so that's a significant concern. The bill, as I mentioned, also increases the fees and violations for illegally diverting. And that's something that we're supportive of. That's something that all the water agencies throughout California are supportive of because we strongly believe in the existing water rights system. And if people are illegally diverting, that harms all water users. And so, yes, increase those.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, how about Assembly Bill 1337?
Yeah, AB 1337 is specifically related to curtailment and curtailment authority. And so the bill and the author, they argue that curtailment authority needs to be expanded as a just effective water management tool, and that with the changes in climate and hydrology, that there's going to be more instances in the future that the state board needs to be able to issue these curtailment authority. And so currently they are able to issue curtailments under a drought declaration or, subsequent critically dry years. This bill would expand curtailment authority over all water right holders in the state and in all water year types. So this is something that a year like this, one of the wettest years on record, why would we possibly need to be curtailed?
Right.
There's so much water in the system. So AB 1337 would also expand curtailment authority over pre-1914 water rights. And so back in the 2014-2015, the state board issued curtailments really for the first time. And those were challenged. And those were challenged by TID. Those were challenged by other senior water right holders who said that the state board lacked the authority to issue curtailment under a very specific water code section that the state board issued it under. So in September 2022, the senior water right holders, those people that filed that lawsuit, we won. And the Sixth Circuit Court said that the state board did not have that authority. And therefore, those curtailments under that very specific water code does not apply. And so the author clearly has stated that this bill is introduced to overturn that the court decision showed that there is an issue and that the state board should have that authority. So this is a direct result of the court case that we won last year.
Wow.
So one of the other things that the author talks a lot about is that this bill needs pre-1914 water rights need to be under the exact same jurisdiction as post-1914 water rights in terms of curtailment. And so this is where the conversation about equity comes up often. And so this is something that we have, advocated on and, telling our unique story, like I mentioned earlier. And so, as I mentioned, we hold our water rights on behalf of our diverse community. And in fact, 67.3% of the community that TID represents identified as members of racial or ethnic minority groups, according to the last census. And so that's something that we highlight a lot. So these are pre-1914 water rights. Yes, we have water rights back to 1871, but this is our population. This is our community. This is who we serve. And so when we have this conversation around equity, and it's a conversation we definitely should have, we're not advocating not having it, but just because you hold a pre-1914 water right does not mean that you do not serve that and provide that on behalf of a diverse community.
Sure, absolutely.
So combined TID and MID, when we jointly hold these water rights, we serve a population of more than 600,000 customers. And so combined, over 61% of the community that TID and MID serve represents as a racial or ethnic minority group, according to that census. And so that's something that we highlight and point out quite a lot whenever that conversation comes up.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So one other thing with this piece of legislation is just curtailments in general and curtailments as an effective water management practice. And so curtailments have typically been issued in the third year of a drought, second year of a drought, when there's a lack of water. And so a lot of times they issue these curtailments and say that they are to protect the fishery species and also to protect senior water right holders because it's the priority system. And so we want to make sure that people aren't diverting outside of their right. Therefore, you're protecting the senior water right holders. But TID, the districts, we're the senior most water right holder on the Tuolumne system. And so one thing that I say often is, how is curtailing our water rights protecting our water rights?
Right. It doesn't make sense.
And so it's kind of one of those questions that we point out. We also ask, what did curtailments provide to the state? What's the quantification of the water saved? And that's something that we haven't seen. And so, yes, times of drought requires different water management practices, but do we think that curtailments blanket across the state take into consideration all the unique water operations factors for every water system? Because we're all different. And so, one thing in terms of the fishery benefit is the districts, we have minimum flow requirements, right? There's been conversations about this on the podcast, many different podcasts. We're always meeting those minimum fish flow requirements. And so it's very clear how much water is going to be in the system, regardless of whether it's a wet or dry year, regardless of if it's the fourth year of a drought. There's a set amount of water at a minimum that is going to be within the system. So again, what does the curtailment do for the fishery in the Tuolumne River that is not already being done? And so it's one thing that a lot of times when we're talking about specific legislation, we talk to the details that are in the bill, and then we talk about broader, like, here's how we manage the system, right? Here's all the technology that Wes and Olivia use that we've talked about on this podcast many times. Here's the unique circumstances with TID, MID, our relationship with the city and county in San Francisco, how we have the water bank, how we have stored water accounting that happens between all the agencies. That's all a unique circumstance that you need to be able to have conversations like this with members of the legislature or staffers to explain why you're opposed to it. Because that's really important. It's not just issuing this, hey, we're opposed to this piece of legislation. Mm-hmm. We're opposed to it because of these reasons. So if there's some situation you're trying to solve, maybe there's water systems on the state that have hundreds of water right users. Maybe they're not as sophisticated water operators as we are. We don't necessarily need the state to tell us there's not water available to divert under our right. We know that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so we talked about AB 46, which focused on an increased authority for the State Water Resources Control Board and their ability to issue these interim relief orders. And then AB 1337 that would enable rights that were perfected prior to the existence of the State Water Resources Control Board to be curtailed by them, in addition to just broader curtailment opportunities across the board. What about Senate Bill 389 then?
Yeah, SB 389 is really introduced, and this is what the author says, is it argues that the State Water Board needs additional authority to have a thorough and up-to-date data to assess water availability for all water right holders so that better water management decisions can be made. So in general, this is something that we support, right? TID is a huge advocate of detailed data, informed decision-making, real-time data to best inform our processes at the district. However, this bill goes much further than just that detailed data. So this bill would allow the state board to investigate and make determination of a water right that is valid and potentially to determine that right or a portion of that right isn't being used, therefore it's forfeited. And that's a massive expansion of current law. So current law, the state can investigate water rights regardless of if it's a pre-1914 or a post-1914. But there's a very detailed administrative process that we are able to go through when that type of challenge happens. And that's not something that the state board just issues, but it's a other water right holder who brings up an issue or says, we think maybe somebody is diverting outside their right. Maybe they're, diverting too much water. Therefore, this process starts. And so it starts from the process of somebody is raising a potential issue. Therefore, this type of investigation begins. This bill would now just allow the state board to say, hey, TID, this one water right, prove up that this is your issue. And again, all of our information is public.
Sure.
All of our diversion, all of our how we use each water right is reported annually. And so on the face, that's not a huge issue for us. It's the next step, the forfeiting water rights, removing of that due process. This is where we have those issues. And this is kind of a sensitive topic because at its highest level, when these arguments are formed, who would be opposed to better data? Who would be opposed to, we should know how much water everybody is diverting?
Absolutely.
Yes, of course, right? Like in general, that just seems something
logical.
Exactly. Everybody could get behind. It's then the next step. It's the next detail. And that's where these conversations happen, is at this very sentence by sentence level, what this does, how this changes existing law, and where this removes some of the rights that we have.
I see.
So in general, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many different steps in this process, and the way the bills are introduced, the way that they look is likely going to be very different depending on the week. And so these bills will likely be changed, amended. We're proposing amendments and changes. There's other agencies who are proposing that. And so while I'm talking about these bills as they currently sit, there's a high likelihood that next week, the week after, it could look completely different. And it could remove out some of our concern. And that's great. And then now we can just focus on the other areas of concern. And so it's a multiple step process.
Yeah, truly. And so as these bills are currently changing and being amended, as you mentioned, what are the next steps forward then for each of these bills? How do they go from here?
Yeah, so where these bills sit in the current legislative session and process is all three bills moved out of their house of origin. So AB 460, 1337, they moved out of the Assembly before the statutory deadline to move bills out of their house of origin. Senate Bill 389 did the exact same thing. And so now they're in the opposite house, and now they're going to be referred to their policy committee. They're going to be referred to the Judiciary Committee in AB 460's case because that has some due process concerns. And then if it's financially tagged, it will go in front of the Appropriations. And so what we're doing right now is you look at who sits on each one of these policy committees. You look at what kind of bills they've had in the past, where their positions on these type of bills. So in the Senate, it's going in front of the Natural Resources Committee. So 460 and 1337 are going to go there. One of the members who sits on that committee is Senator Allen, who is the author of SB 389. Mm-hmm. So you kind of have an idea of where he's going to be on the bill, where his focus is. And then luckily 389 went in front of Natural Resources about a month ago. And so you got to hear the questions that the other members were asking. So you got to hear kind of the way that they approach these issues. Therefore, you kind of take that knowledge, you take it to 460 and 1337, and you start forming your arguments for those specific members. So you start vote counting, saying, okay, who do we need to try to, who's maybe more susceptible to listening to these reasons that we have, these issues. You look at what water agencies are in their communities. Do they have a strong voice? Is that something that these members in the past have been receptive to those comments? And then you start lobbying. You start lobbying the bill.
Oh, boy.
Any point along the way, these bills can be killed or they can be amended. And so, but as you get further on in the process, the likelihood that they're going to be amended is being reduced, right? And so as they clear more and more of these hurdles, to some degree, the author kind of can feel a little emboldened and like, well, we don't need to take these amendments in order for the bill to move because I think it's going to move. It's already cleared a couple of these hurdles. So that kind of gets back to that earlier conversation I had about how we approach advocacy and at what stage in the process it is. Can we amend a bill to remove our opposition? Can we just kill a bill outright? Or is a bill moving forward in the way that it's currently situated is so terrible to the district that we need to just minimize that impact? It's still going to be bad, but we just need to minimize it.
Right.
And so we're at that point where that calculus is changing because it's in the second house now. And so now we're having all those conversations again and really developing that strategy to move forward.
This is fun stuff.
I love it. Most people, when I tell them what I do for the district, they have one or two reactions. They say, oh, that's interesting. Or they say, that's terrible. Sounds actually like absolutely horrible to actually have to deal with all this politics, deal with the regulatory or legislative bodies. Like, don't want to do that.
You certainly have to have the fortitude for it.
Well, I'm a political science major, so I love politics, and so this is what I love to do.
Absolutely. Oh, that's great. All right. So what is the district then specifically doing to try and combat some of these bills that we believe are going to have negative impacts towards the way we run our operations?
Yeah, so there are so many different ways to engage on pieces of legislation, and oftentimes it's not just one thing. And so it's a variety of measures. And so at the most basic level, we are engaging just directly ourselves. As TID, we are meeting with our delegation. We're meeting with the authors. We're meeting with the staffers who write the analysis for the committee. And we are lobbying our issues directly to the decision makers. And then we're also working with our partners on the river, so the Modesto Irrigation District and the City and County of San Francisco. And so we're talking collectively as water users on the Tuolumne River and what those impacts are and why these bills are impactful. And then we're also members of the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority, and so that represents the Tuolumne and the Stanislaus River. And so we're working through those collective agencies and making our voice even larger and louder on those specific issues. And then we're actively engaging with our industry associations like the Association of California Water Agencies or the California Municipal Utilities Associations. We're part of many different organizations at a state level. And these groups have legislative committees. They have lobbyists. They have their own coalitions. And so a lot of times if you can get an association that carries a certain amount of weight, AQUA, for example, the Association of California Water Agencies, they represent over 450 water agencies throughout the California. And so that brings weight and that brings geographic diversity of the entire state into those discussions. So it's not just Stanislaus, Merced, Tuolumne County, it is the entire state association. And so that can be really beneficial. And so we're working and advocating, and I lobby with their lobbyists directly in Sacramento And so that's actions that we're taking in Sacramento. But one of the most important things is actions that TID is taking, talking to our customers, letting our customers know what is happening, what are the potential impacts, and what that means to them, whether as individuals, as businesses, as counties, as different industry groups. What do these bills potentially mean for impacting our water supply, and how downstream of that are they going to be impacted because they are users of whether it's our irrigation water or electricity as well, because this impacts all customers in our service territory.
Sure. So it really sounds like TID is kind of taking everything from a macro approach in working with our other water agencies throughout the state down to a very micro approach of trying to help our customers understand how some of these things might impact them individually.
Exactly. And so whenever there is an opportunity, whether that is at the statewide level or whether it's talking to a handful of people in a room, we take that opportunity, right? It is, again, back to that philosophy of talking about telling TID's unique story in our background and doing that from the customer, whether we put that in our quarterly newsletters that we send out or our monthly email that we send out to growers. We're taking every opportunity to just provide people information. And that's really something that, you guys all do incredibly well at, is taking all the tools that we have and talking about the latest thing that could potentially impact them. Most people won't ever know that this type of thing impacts them.
Sure.
But it has the potential to have significant impacts to just our daily lives.
Absolutely. Well, and that's one of the reasons why we love doing this podcast, is to bring that information to light for the general population. All right. So it seems that each one of these bills kind of chips away at a different aspect of the water rights system. But as we've said, even at the beginning of this podcast, the system as a whole is a foundational way that the district provides water to our customers. So how does any one of these moving forward impact our operations?
Yeah, what these bills all have certain things that they do individually, but collectively, all these bills provide uncertainty. They provide uncertainty to the water rights system, which then impacts the entire water system throughout the entire state of California. And so all aspects of our livelihood as Californians are dependent on the water system and the billions of dollars that have been invested in that infrastructure. And that infrastructure was invested in, is maintained every year based off of this expectation and the certainty of the water rights system. And so when very vague pieces of legislation are introduced that would target and dramatically change the water rights system, that just provides uncertainty for our current supplies, let alone the future. And so as California, clearly we have a housing issue. There's not enough affordable housing. There's not enough housing in general. Nobody can build any more housing if you cannot identify a certain set of your water supply. You need to make sure that you have water supply for any housing development. And so what does this do to help us meet our state goals and our needs for housing if you are threatening or providing uncertainty to the housing industry?
Absolutely. It stretches much farther than, are our growers going to have water for crops? Are our cities going to have water to provide for domestic use? There are implications that a lot of folks don't think about. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, uncertainty is something that the district, we spend so much of our time to remove uncertainty as much as we can on the water side and on the power side. Right, on the power side, we want to make sure that our customers have a reliable supply of electricity, that when it is 110 outside, that our customers aren't going to be without power. And so we invest so much in certainty. On the water side, the exact same thing, right? We invest in so many new technologies to remove uncertainty so that we know what our water supply is going to be and so that we can make decisions to best manage those resources. So anytime you throw uncertainty into this mix, for an organization like ours that is planning for decades in the future, that provides so much uncertainty, so much questions about what does the future even look like.
Absolutely. And so to kind of break that down into simplified terms, you are certain you're going to get a paycheck whenever that paycheck comes. If you aren't, and you do what you need to do, you work hard, you complete the tasks that are required of your job to ensure that you get that paycheck. If you didn't know that was coming, you're not going to buy a house. You're not going to buy a car because you don't know that you can't reliably plan for those expenditures in the future. So I think that's a very basic example of how TID has to approach the issue of the uncertainty that these bills could potentially provide to or impact the water system.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy.
So let's kind of flip the script a little bit. And we've talked a lot about, some of the detrimental impacts. Are there any improvements to the water system that TID is supportive of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think anytime that there's stressors on the system, anytime that we go through an instance like drought and you have these curtailments throughout the state, they highlight potential areas for improvement. And, our heads aren't in the sand about this kind of thing, right? There's ways to improve the system, and we fully support that. And so we support the system through improving the system through a variety of ways. And I think what I want to say about that before we even get in is we support very specific targeted solutions for issues raised. And so I think that that's very important. If there's an issue that is presented itself, let's propose a solution to address that. I think too often in politics, there's an issue that is raised, and rather than addressing that issue specifically, we introduce massive piece of legislation that they do address that issue, but they create so many other issues. And so I feel like there would be much more agreement specifically on some of these pieces of legislation if the bills were targeted at what the solution or at what the problem that they state the bill is the solution for. There's a lot of agreement on some of these points. And so we support several improvements and enhancements of the existing water rights system. And so at the most basic level, we support the existing water rights system and the authorities that the state board already has. And we just want active enforcement of that system. So there's been conversations that there's inadequate funding or there is inadequate staffing to enforce the existing water rights system. So we as the district are supportive of increasing those funding, increasing the staff to implement the existing water rights system. We think that that's probably the first step. Like if there is something that is limiting the ability to implement the existing system, let's address that before then we make these wholehearted,
sweeping changes.
Yeah. Exactly. And so we think that that's a good first step. We do think that increasing fees and penalties for those who illegally divert, yes, we agree with that 100%. And so going back to that Shasta River issue and those fines that were so small, increase them. All the water agencies do that. We support that kind of thing because, again, we're the good actors. We're not illegally diverting. We're not going to pay these penalties because we're not going to be illegally diverting. So if you are going to try to increase those, create a deterrent. Mm-hmm. Right now, that fee structure, it's not a deterrent. So I think that's something that we all can get behind is increasing those penalties. And then, should those penalties be increased even higher during, droughts, during times when scarcity is even more in the system? I think that's something that we would support as well.
Those more critical times.
Absolutely. So in increasing funding for the state board for better data management efforts and including upgrading the water rights system, the records they have. So right now, a lot of the water right records are paper records. And the state board has been under the last few years have got significant funds from the state government to digitize those records. And that's something that we support. We have those records digitally. They're on our website, mm-hmm. right? And so we think, digitize those records. There shouldn't be 11 million documents of paper records of how the water in the state is managed.
Yeah, make them more
effective. Yes.
Make them more accessible to help answer those questions that folks might have as to whether or not rights are being appropriately used and whatnot. Put the information out there.
So this is a multi-year effort to digitize these records. And so this year there's a budget request of $31 million to digitize these records. And that's something that TID, that we support wholeheartedly. One other thing that we support is funding for installation of stream gauges at very specific locations and just encouraging the collection of and use of real-time data. And so that's something that TID, we strongly invest in ourselves out of our budget every year, is enhancing the stream systems, the measurement systems that we use, because that's crucial to how we operate and manage the entire water system. And so that's something that we strongly believe in. You can go onto our website right now and see what the lake level is at Don Pedro. You can see what the diversions to TID and MID's canal are. You can see what the stream gauge is at Modesto at the 9th Street gauge. And so this is crucial. And so, yes, we support that wholeheartedly. One thing that's funny is, not funny, it's kind of sad, is that this year there was a piece of legislation introduced as SB 361 by Senator Dodd that would allocate and prioritize which stream gauges we need to fund and replace throughout the state to help us meet these goals. And that bill got held in committee, right? And that got labeled as a fiscal impact to the state, rightfully so. And that bill died for this year. And so if we are talking about better management of the water rights system and adding all these new enhanced authorities to the state board system, but yet we can't, as the state legislature, acknowledge that we need to invest in the stream gauge system so that we can better manage our system. Like, the hypocrisy in that is just, it's too much, right?
Absolutely. We're not going to give them the data with which to manage the system.
Exactly. And so there's an often cited saying that, you can't manage what you can't measure. And it's pretty true.
True.
And so the state that there shouldn't be stream gauges throughout the state that don't work.
Absolutely.
I feel like that's something that all Californians we would agree with, right? Like, this is California. We have the best technology in the world. Let's make sure that we can measure the water that's flowing throughout the state.
Yeah. It seems like a no-brainer.
So that's something that we will continue to support as TID through our budget process and making sure that we have the latest and accurately measured system. That's something that we'll continue to support throughout the state. So anytime that there's a piece of legislation introduced, I'm going to support that, right? The district's going to support that. Just fun, even if it doesn't impact the Tuolumne, that's just something, good governance throughout the state that we support.
Sure.
And then there's also, the ability, a year like this, there's so much water. There's a large agreement that we need to be putting that water to beneficial use. We need to be getting it into the groundwater aquifers to recharge those aquifers. And so anytime that there's legislation that is introduced that, sets these long-term goals or anything specifically to that, we're going to support that because we believe in that, right? We filed for water rights specifically to do that.
Makes sense. All right. So now let's talk about the future outlook of water rights in California. Obviously, a lot of that is dependent upon what ultimately comes out of this year and future years of legislation. But what would you say that we can anticipate in the next 5 years or so?
I think we can anticipate many more years like this, where there is multiple pieces of legislation being introduced that, whether in small or in very large ways, will change the water rights system. And so I think that there's just a very large coordinated effort to modernize or blow up or completely overhaul the water rights system. And I think that because in the last few years, we've seen so many specific pieces of legislation introduced, some are being received well. I think that there will be more and more people that are emboldened to let's go through the legislative effort to change the water rights system. And so I think we're going to see multiple pieces of legislation and regulatory changes on the water rights system. And I think that that's going to just provide water users and everybody in California with a certain level of uncertainty moving forward. So like I mentioned, I think too often we propose very vague, large piece of legislation or solutions rather than very targeted measures to address where there does need to be changes. And so unfortunately, I kind of feel like these large sweeping, very large statements will lead to overly broad pieces of legislation that actually won't move forward the system. And that's unfortunate. I think that there's water agencies, others who agree that there's changes that should be made, and let's focus on those. Let's actually have the conversation about how to improve the system. That conversation shouldn't be had in a legislative policy committee hearing where you have a sponsor and you have the opposition, right? That doesn't lead to productive outcomes, right? We should have those dialogues outside of the legislative session and then come as a unified coalition from all over the water, the environmental side. And here's our solution. Let's move this forward. Let's get unanimous support through both houses and get it to the governor. I think that there's actual opportunities to do that.
Absolutely. And as you said, find solutions that address what's wrong, that address the specific problem, not just, blowing up and recreating the system for the sake of doing so, but actually addressing the issues that have been identified.
Exactly. I think if that was the tactic this year, I think that we would already be in agreement on these three pieces of legislation. I think that there's room for agreement. There's room for compromise. And I think we could be moving forward with that. Unfortunately, these bills that we're currently fighting this year, more than anything, they just provide uncertainty. And when water is so fundamental to the entire state, especially our region, that just is creating significant issues and just uncertainty. And I think that you see that through the coalition that is opposing these legislation. It's not just water agencies, right? It's water agencies, yes. It's cities, it's counties, it's building industry groups, it's housing agencies, it's, the farming industry. So many, everybody relies on water. It's economic development agencies across the state who are opposed to this. And so, these are just applying pressures on the water system. We have serious hurdles as a state that we have to address, right? The firm yield of the water supply is changing because of climate change over the coming years. Population is increasing. Demand on the water system is increasing. And so we need to be focusing on those solutions. What are we going to do to add supply to the system to be, more efficient with the water supply we do have? We should be focusing on those issues that are going to address some of these significant challenges rather than providing more uncertainty.
But again, as you mentioned, some of the solutions to those problems come with the expense of additional infrastructure and shoring up our existing infrastructure. And why would a water agency make that sort of investment if we're uncertain that we're going to be able to continue to provide water in the way that we have?
Yeah, 100%. And so you have to have certainty in order to make investment. And so with the water rights that we applied for last year, we all agree, and the entire state is saying that when there's times of excess, we need to be putting that to use. We agree. Well, you need certainty in order to make those large investments, to build the infrastructure, to divert that water, to put it to use. Nobody is going to make those investments without the assurance that you have the right to do that.
Absolutely.
So one thing I will say is that the coordinated effort to go after water rights in the last few years, I think it is actually producing a little bit of good. And so historically, water agencies are notoriously bad at talking about what we do. What we do is just fundamental. A lot of people, you take it for granted. It's the water supply. It's going to be there.
So long as we keep doing it, no one questions it.
Exactly. And so we, as the water agency throughout California, haven't really talked about water rights. And, I think when we did the podcast with Jason, back very early on, that was probably the first time I remember an agency really talking, just opening the books about the water rights system. And I know internally we had a lot of people who were questioning, why are you guys doing that? This is only going to raise issues. And we think it's really important, right? And without our voice on the subject as the subject matter experts, as the ones doing it, the narrative is filled in by everybody else.
Sure.
And so we need to be out there talking publicly about what we're doing, why we do things a certain way, what certainty provides to our community. And so I think we're seeing more and more conversation about water rights happening. It's happening in venues like this. It's different conversations. It's in commentary in the newspapers all up and down the state now. And so I think it's leading to a lot more conversation about what the water rights system is as a whole and what changes potentially mean. So I do think that if we're looking for glimmers of hope, I think that there's some benefit in having water agencies talk more often and more in detail about what we actually do.
Right on. And I appreciate you helping to bring it full circle with that bit of positivity there at the end. It's not all devastation and gloom.
Yeah. If anybody who stayed around for this entire podcast, I don't want them to just think everything is bad. There is some positivity. There's some things moving forward.
Very good. All right. So as we've mentioned during the course of today's session, episode 7 with Jason Carkeet is all about water rights, kind of a deeper dive into what those water rights look like. So folks can get more information there. Where else can someone go if they want to learn more about either TID water rights or water rights in general?
Sure. So TID.org/water rights. And this is a page that we put up earlier this year that's really like a one-stop shop for all the information about TIDs and MIDs water rights. And so we have a link to Jason's podcast on there. We have links to all of our water rights filings with the state board. So even though the state board's website might be hard to navigate and be able to find, we have direct links from our website for every water right and where our filings are. So you can get all that information there. We also have information about these bills. We have our support or opposition letters listed there. We have coalition letters. And so really we want our community to know that there's one spot to go and get information, and that's TID.org/water rights.
Very good. All right, Josh, thanks for joining us again today and bringing us some, again, useful information that a lot of people don't even realize have such a great impact on the district, but are clearly very important to our operations. So we appreciate you being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.